Our speaker today is Bob Hill. He asked me if I was introducing him today. I said, yes, what do you want me to say? I'm not going to repeat what he told me. Bob has been a member forever and has spoken too many times to count. And so we are quite pleased to have him speak once again today.
First, I would like to say, Fred, I'm glad the puppy is getting you trained. My topic this morning I titled River Worlds. Most Christians continue to believe that the stories of the Bible are factual events. They fail to grasp the idea that the Bible is a religious document and not a historical book or a scientific text. The stories of the Bible are based on myth about unexplainable events in the lives of primitive people. Though they're wonderful metaphorical stories, and we find them in texts like the Bible, the Quran, and the Torah, these stories seldom accurately represent either history or science. To understand why and how we came to believe such myths as factual, we have to travel back several thousand years. So I'd like to go back this morning to a period of time when the population of the earth was less than 100 million people, far distant from the place that we are now at 6 or 7 billion people on the planet. The places we're going this morning are called river worlds. For thousands of years, human beings settled along riverbanks, particularly along the Nile, the Jordan, the Tiger, and Euphrates rivers. The Middle East has always been a very harsh and barren land, and the only real living environments were along river's edge. These lush river bases were the only places suitable for civilization to gain a foothold. Imagine, if you will, living in small patches of cultivated vegetation surrounded by nothing but very barren, hostile terrain. These were linear worlds, long strips of land that followed meandering rivers. In some places, the patches were as narrow as a few inches, and at the widest part, only 20 miles. Picture in your mind these settlements looked much like dots on a measuring tape that meandered across the country. Not being able to spread out, tribes had to spread up and down the rivers, often marching through the territory of other people. Human nature being what it is, that caused a lot of tribal disputes. So there were constant wars and battles over these little small areas. Armies would push through a particular territory, and then they would get pushed back. Small and weak tribes would be subsumed by larger tribes. Slaves were taken. People were murdered, cities and temples destroyed, and other cities were built right on the same sites. With nowhere to spread out, land was at a premium, so sites were often destroyed and rebuilt many times. People would first be of one tribe, then they would be of another tribe, perhaps changing tribes many times because of being conquered and reconquered. No one in the Middle East knows for sure what tribe they originally came from because of repeated wars and territorial disputes. As a result, today, residents of the Middle East tend to identify with the last tribe they ended up in. Because of these horrific tribal fightings in the Middle East, people of this region are amazingly amalgamated. They probably shouldn't do 23andMe. They might be as shocked as Steve was. This region is often referred to as the Fertile Crescent because of its shape. But with its long history of volatility, it could be called the Crescent of Conflict. It can also be called the Mother of Myth. More of the world's myth came from the Middle East than any other part of the globe. Middle Easterners created thousands of myths thousands of years ago to explain the unexplained. Unfortunately, many of these myths are still believed today as being factual events. Competition between cultures was fierce, leading to inconceivable acts of brutality. Both the Old and the New Testament reflects much of this violent history. Though it's not necessarily historically accurate, these holy documents describe wars, sackings, burning of cities, murder, torture, and enslavement of men, women, and children. Also describe the worst of betrayal and deceit. These books also reflect fires, floods, earthquakes, which were all the mystical acts of God. In comparison, the books of the Bible with historical and archaeological findings, it is easy to see how these events were considered either gifts from the gods or punishment from the gods for disobeying Him. It's much harder, of course, to reconcile how these myths continue and are referred to as the inerrant works of a supreme deity. Between the burning and sacking of cities, the rebuilding of them was often 4, 5, and 6 times at the same location, and this helped to create the myths. Naturally occurring events like earthquakes and floods and other events would reveal the power of their gods. There was always a story to explain why these things happened, and over time these stories were embellished. Characters were added, names were changed to meet the parochial needs, and thus myths were born, and they keep building on them. For example, the biblical character of Moses is in all likelihood a composite of 2 or 3 different people morphed into one. This is a common practice in the development of mythical stories. In spite of the brutality, river worlds gave the world their very first libraries, street lights, residential housing, indoor plumbing with flush toilets, advanced metallurgy, masonry, and herbal medicine. The winds of change, however, could quickly destroy a city. Mud from the floods, volcanic ash raining down, and shifting ground from earthquakes and blowing sands could quickly claim a town and at the same time create a brand new site to build a whole new city on. Often these sites would not even be recognized as the former site of a former city. Layer after layer concealed the lives of those people who had lived there before, forgotten in time, except for their legends and myths. It's interesting to speculate if living with the constant threat of floods and mud gave rise to the idea that God formed man out of the mud from the river. It's also the story of humankind rising out of the rubble. This is an inspirational message, and it also not only addresses the destruction of the disasters, but it's how human beings pick themselves up and start all over again. Not unlike today, each separate group along river worlds had their stereotypic view of the others. For example, townspeople thought that the nomadic tribes were ignorant and barbaric, while the nomads viewed the city people as being sinful, full of gambling, sex, treachery, and deceit. For both, however, it must have seemed that they were always standing at the doorstep of doom. To add to the conflicts over living space, there were constant battles over whose God was the most powerful. Politics and religion have forever been a source for hatred. People of the Middle East had many different gods, religious dogmas, politics, and economic views. The idea of monotheism, for example, took root very slowly, and it was not uncommon for people to go from monotheism back to a pantheon of God. The time between 650 before the current age to 750 before the current age, approximately 900 years, is what it took for the plurality of God to be transformed by the Hebrews into a single omnipotent God. It was a hard life, and belief in gods or God offered hope to people struggling under the worst conditions. Often gods were the only plausible explanation in a pre-scientific world. For such events as storms and earthquakes, fire, birth, and death, gods and dogmas were the only tool used for survival. So, if you wrap a catastrophe in a mythical legend, it can be passed down through the ages to future generations. Long before paper and pencil, even before clay tablets, legends and myths were taught and sung to children. Rhythmic songs were how we passed on the lore. Children learned these songs often before they even knew what they meant. It's much the way we teach 3-year-olds now. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. This is how they translated the myths. Eventually these stories were transferred to clay tablets and then to the printed word. Each succeeding generation would borrow stories and myths from the previous generation, even from other cultures, adding and deleting from them to meet the political or social needs of the day. For example, the 10 Commandments reportedly given to Moses by God are almost an exact replica of the orders given by the Babylonian king Hammurabi many years before. The Hebrew story of the infant Moses set adrift in a reed basket is a story used at least twice before. The Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten and the Babylonian king Sargon the Great were both set adrift in reed baskets. Exaggerated stories enhance the idea that their gods and their kings were superordinary human beings that offered them hope. The combination of a hard life and the realization of mortality contributed to the idea that we human beings can live outside the here and now. The early Sumerian epic poem of Lancelot Gilgamesh taught people that the only thing that survives us is the memory of our deeds. This was a moral lesson used to accomplish good deeds while on this side of the life. The story of the Garden of Eden is an interesting one. This myth seems to have originated in Babylon, but it also found its way in Egyptian mythology long before the Hebrews adopted it. The second chapter of Genesis describes the Garden of Eden as being along a river world. It was a lush world of vegetation and water. When Adam and Eve were forced to leave the river world, they were left to wander in a harsh land. This sounds like a story that nomadic people might have used to justify their wandering in the desert. Of all the stories passed down through the ages, the story of the Great Flood is perhaps the best example of how there is a little seed of truth in almost every legend. God caused this event, the Great Flood, because people disobeyed Him. We all know how the story of under the tutelage of God, Noah built an ark and then loaded it with animals. And it rained for 40 days and nights, covering the entire earth. And everyone but Noah and his family and his animals were destroyed. And they were, by the way, the clean animals. Well, that myth is based on a grain of truth. Archaeological findings indicate that in the year approximately 2800 before the current age, there was a massive flood that covered the entire plain between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Every town and settlement in this entire area was buried beneath huge, thick layers of mud. It would be impossible to estimate the number of people that died in this flood, as well as the loss of livestock. If you did live along the river, then most primitive people would never travel more than a few miles from home. So if this type of flood occurred, it would have to seem to all people that the whole world, the whole earth was covered by a flood. So it wasn't just one flood either that was responsible for the myth. Flooding in this region was a common occurrence. The Tigris and the Euphrates River were very unstable rivers, and between them, this floodplain was low, and any heavy rain would cause the banks to overflow. Anyone living in the floodplain would be underwater. People living along the Nile River had very different experiences. The Nile River is much more stable and predictable, and so the people along the Nile River developed very different mythologies. Our mythologies usually relate to the type of terrain that we live in. River world gods are very different from mountain and forest world gods. Where we live often dictates the gods we worship and the mythologies we maintain. For primitive people and even fundamentalist believers today, misfortune represents the idea that we have done something wrong and we have offended our God or gods. Teaching stories like this give people an explanation for the terrible events that occur to us. If I had just done this, God wouldn't have punished me. If I had just done that, God wouldn't have punished me. Because we do not have absolute knowledge even today, we remain vulnerable to believe in being the recipients of good fortune because we are blessed, or bad fortune because we have offended our deity. We cling to our mythologies because they help us to understand the world, even if it isn't accurate. Most myths have a grain of truth in them. Over time, that grain of truth gets embellished or in some way modified over time. We hold on to myths because there are generally moral lessons in them and not historical facts. Myths do provide an explanation for things we do not understand. And even if it's not scientifically accurate, it still provides us some explanation for the unexplainable. Ancient myths also give us insight into our distant past to help us to understand how early humans interpreted the world they lived in. If we take the flood myth as printed in the Bible and contrast it with scientific information, we see how normal events get turned into mythology. There must have been several authors of the same story, because if you read different religious texts, you find that they are interpreted differently. To understand biblical myth and its importance, we need to read, for example, the book of Genesis. Begin reading at chapter 6, verse 9, and read to chapter 9, verse 19. Noah was first told to take on one pair of animals onto the ark. Then this was changed to 7 pairs of animals. Then it was changed again to 2 pairs. This more than likely indicates that there were several authors writing about the same story. The flood is said to have covered the mountains by 15 cubits. Now, a cubit is the distance from the fingertips to the elbow. Now, of course, that's going to vary depending upon the length of a person's arms. So, that would mean that the mountains were covered by approximately 22 feet. Now, the modern biblical proof is that we can still find seashells and sea fossils in the Aragos Mountains, as well as on most mountain tops and ridges. Modern day geology explains this by pointing out that the mountains were pushed up from the sea. The Earth's geology has changed many times over in 4.5 billion years. Clean animals were most likely animals that were suitable for food and sacrifice, which means that many of the animals we eat today, like swine, would not have been invited on a 40-day cruise. And if you use the one pair myth, one pair of animals would have been eaten or sacrificed, and they would have become extinct. We can conclude that a single pair story was very different from the seven-pair myth. Without going to it, imagine putting thousands of pairs of animals on a 60 or 70-foot wooden boat and then feeding them and cleaning up after them would have been an impossible task. One must keep in mind that we're trying to understand the thought processes of people who lived 3,000 years ago, long before there was any scientific explanation. With any ancient document, we're dealing with multiple rewrites, transcripts, and interpretations several thousand years after the fact. To dogmatically insist on the inherency of words printed in 2000 edition of holy books based on 4,000-year-old tradition is really not very reasonable. We are certain that the editors of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, combined, added, and deleted early Hebrew and Christian mythologies to come up with the books that we have today. In an effort to demonstrate how myths were borrowed from other cultures and changed and borrowed to suit new cultures, we look at the flood myth. There is a much earlier Babylonian story of the flood. There was a Babylonian hero by the name of Upeshtim who was part of the religious dogma. And these religious dogmas were part of the temples. Therefore, in some way, they had to relate to their god. The Babylonian story says that God was angry with the people because they were too noisy. So God destroyed them with a flood. Upeshtim built an ark and loaded it with 2 pair of each animal on earth. After the flood, Upeshtim sent out birds when the ark had landed on Mount Nasser, which is different from Mount Ararat where Noah landed. We know the Babylonian story because archaeologists have found tablet fragments dating back to the 14th century before the current era. These tablets were found when they were excavating various sites. We know that the Babylonian story was based on an earlier Sumerian story of the flood. The Sumerian priest named Zasustra built an ark, filled it with animals, and survived a great flood. One argument supporting the flood myth is the fact that wood fragments have been found on Mount Ararat. Religious leaders today claim that they are part of the ark. However, carbon dating places these fragments to the 5th or 6th century of our current era. Scholars believe these pieces of wood are actually remnants of a small monastery erected as a shrine for the ark. Every mythical story in the Bible can be explained and compared with history and archaeological findings. In doing so, it is easy to see that most myths have a tiny grain of truth that led to the story. For example, the Tower of Babel is a wonderful allegorical story, but most inadequate in explaining why we speak different languages. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and the parting of the Red Sea can all be explained with archaeological findings. Religious leaders today preach that the book of Daniel, and particularly the book of Revelation, are end-time predictions. Scholars trained in major academic institutions where religion is taught in the Department of Religion and Archaeology generally agree that the book of Daniel is about the destruction of Babylon, and the book of Revelations predicts the fall of the Roman Empire. Revelations is not an end time prediction. It's a book of Hebrew prophecy that their greatest enemy, the Roman army, would fall and they would be free of this occupying army. These were documents for a specific time in history and specific to a geographical area, not river worlds. Old Midrashic stories, or old Jewish stories, are put together by taking an old legend, taking an event, borrowing characters, changing the situation, and weaving it into a teaching story. They were not necessarily meant to be the inerrant word of God and to be interpreted as facts. They may have been meant to be used the way we use mythical stories today. For example, if I began a story long, long ago and far, far away, you wouldn't view it as historical fact. It can be very entertaining and it can have great social value, but it isn't exactly fact. The stories of river worlds are stories of very fragile beginnings. These are stories of good and bad, struggles of courage. Our stories don't have to be factual to be valuable. We need our myths, and we need our mythical heroes to inspire us and to teach us. Heroes, even mythical heroes, help to break up our prisons of self-doubt. Once we are free of self-doubt, we can break camp and move on to new destinations. This act alone will lead us closer toward the mystery. So why do we believe in myths? Hope. Hope is one of the most powerful human emotions. When we combine hope with energy and fortitude, human beings can be formidable. Thank you.